I adjusted the scarf around my neck and stepped into the warm glow of the Charleston restaurant. My heart fluttering despite the practiced calm I carried like armor. I'm Evelyn Calloway, 62, stubborn, careful, and fiercely proud. And I had spent a lifetime learning how to hold myself steady when life tried to knock me down. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration my son Lucas's promotion. But the moment I entered, I felt the air shift. The table stretched long under a crystal chandelier, white linen gleaming, silverware arranged perfectly. 3 chairs remained empty at one end. My eyes went to them and froze. There wasn't one seat for me before I could process the humiliation. Paige, my daughter-in-law, tilted her wineglass and laughed, voice sharp and loud enough for everyone to hear. "Go beg on the streets, you beggar," she snapped, her words slicing through the polite murmurs of other diners. Gasps echoed around me. A few heads turned. I could feel dozens of eyes on me. And for a heartbeat, my knees trembled. My chest burned. A heat that had nothing to do with the restaurant's warm air. Lucas leaned back in his chair, arms folded, smirking, as if he were watching a performance he had scripted himself. I took a slow, deliberate breath, keeping my shoulders steady. My fingers rested lightly on the leather of my purse. I would not crumble. Not now. Not in front of them. Not in front of anyone. The waiter hovered nearby, uncertain, his gaze flicking between me and Paige. I met his eyes and signaled ever so subtly. A whisper of movement. A quiet command he seemed to understand. The room waited, the tension thick, and I could feel it curling around me, daring me to react. I lifted my head, letting my lips curve into a controlled, calm smile. If they thought I would falter, they were about to discover how wrong they were. I straightened my shoulders and let my gaze sweep across the room, noting every curious glance, every flicker of surprise on the faces around me. The murmur of conversation had dimmed to a cautious hush, the clink of silverware softer, as if the restaurant itself had paused to witness the confrontation. Paige's smirk faltered slightly, though she tried to maintain her composure, and Lucas's eyes darted nervously around, searching for allies among the other diners. I rested my hand lightly on the leather of my purse, feeling the familiar texture grounding me. Years of struggle had taught me how to mask fear, how to hold a calm exterior even when my heart hammered like a drum in my chest. I thought of the long nights balancing spreadsheets in the law office, the early mornings serving tables in the little Italian place where the smell of garlic and tomato sauce mixed with the clatter of plates, the endless weeks of scrubbing floors, cleaning dishes, and making sure my son never went without. Those years had built me quietly, invisibly, into someone who could survive more than anyone imagined. The waiter lingered nearby, tense but watchful. I gave a subtle nod, barely perceptible, and he straightened, understanding my silent instruction. His brief glance at Paige and Lucas was enough. They sensed that I held a quiet command over the room that went far beyond what they could control. I allowed my eyes to meet the gaze of a few nearby diners, and I could see their curiosity mixed with a faint admiration. No one moved, no one spoke, but the weight of expectation settled around us. It wasn't intimidation. It was the anticipation of what would come next, the knowledge that I was about to act without a word. Yet every motion would speak volumes. I inhaled slowly, drawing in the scent of polished wood and rich wine, letting it steady my racing pulse. Then, with a subtle lift of my chin and a controlled tilt of my lips, I made a decision. I would not flinch. I would not apologize. And I would not allow them to dictate the narrative of this evening. Tonight, The balance of power was shifting, and I was ready to claim my place. The soft murmur of the restaurant faded from my mind, replaced by the distant echo of a life I had lived long before this evening. I remembered the day my husband died, sudden and cruel, leaving me 40 years old, widowed, and with a teenage Lucas who needed more than I could offer at the time. I had no safety net, no extended family to lean on, just a small apartment and a lifetime of bills that seemed to multiply overnight. I worked mornings at a tiny law office, answering phones, sorting files, bringing coffee to partners who barely noticed my existence. Evenings were spent scrubbing floors and washing dishes at the neighborhood Italian place, my hands raw from soap and constant labor. Weekends, I learned to manage invoices and negotiate with suppliers, quietly absorbing every detail like a sponge, knowing that knowledge might one day be my armor. Some nights, exhaustion swallowed me whole. I'd collapse onto the narrow couch in our apartment, Lucas asleep beside me, and wonder if I had the strength to continue. But every morning, before the sun fully rose over Charleston, I pulled myself upright, prepared breakfast, and reminded myself, "Get up, Evelyn. Keep going." Lucas depended on it. There were sacrifices I can still feel in my bones. I sold my wedding ring, the only keepsake of our brief. Happy years to cover his first year of college tuition. I watched him hug the receipt, whispering, "I'll make you proud, Mom." And for a moment, the pain was softened by love and hope. Those moments, small and fleeting, became the bedrock of my endurance. I learned every job as if it were a masterclass in survival and skill. At the Italian restaurant, I observed the chef bark orders, the servers smile through exhaustion, the owner managing accounts with an eagle eye. I memorized every movement, every pattern, every protocol. I knew that if I could understand the workings of even the smallest role, I could someday grasp the whole picture, and perhaps build a life that no one could underestimate. Meanwhile, Lucas grew, oblivious to the quiet battles behind each smile and each plate I served. He had friends from wealthy families, and I knew he was embarrassed by my work when they asked. I softened my voice, kept my head down, and watched him navigate a world that felt distant from mine. Years of tireless effort, of quiet determination, and unacknowledged endurance shaped me. They carved into me a strength that was not loud or showy, but enduring and absolute. Every early morning, every exhausted night, every penny saved, every lesson learned, they all led to this evening, to this room, and to the moment I would finally show the world that the quiet sacrifices of a mother could not be dismissed or humiliated. And in that knowledge, I felt the first flicker of a power long earned, ready to claim its moment. Lucas shifted in his seat, leaning back with the kind of arrogance only privilege can cultivate. Paige, his wife, followed his lead, her lips curling into a faint, smug smile as if she were already imagining the evening's victory. Their eyes met mine across the table, and for a moment, I felt the sting of every insult, every dismissal, every mocking word that had been thrown at me in silence over the years. I rested my purse deliberately on the edge of the polished table. The leather landed with a soft, deliberate click that seemed louder than it actually was. All movement in the room slowed. Even the soft jazz playing in the background felt muted, as if the air itself had recognized that something critical was about to happen. "Go beg on the streets, you beggar," Paige repeated, sharper this time, her voice laced with both contempt and amusement. Heads turned. A few guests whispered to each other, glancing between us, curious about the unfolding scene. I could feel the weight of their gaze, but instead of faltering, I allowed it to anchor me. I took a slow breath, letting it fill my lungs completely before exhaling with quiet authority. My fingers tightened around the strap of my purse for just a second before relaxing. I didn't rush. I didn't speak immediately. I let them anticipate my reaction, hoping the tension would be felt in the stillness between words. Finally, I lifted my head and met their eyes evenly. Lucas's smirk faltered, and Paige blinked, caught off guard. My voice was low, calm, and deliberate when I finally spoke. "Fine," I said, letting the single word hang in the air. Then, with a pause that stretched just long enough to draw attention, I added, "But it's you who will have to leave." The room went still. Not stunned silence. Exactly. But the kind of attention that makes a simple statement feel monumental. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred. The balance of power had moved, if only slightly. But the change was unmistakable to those who could perceive it. Lucas's jaw tightened. Paige's shoulders stiffened. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my posture calm and controlled. The guests' curiosity deepened. Some shifted forward in their seats, eyes flicking between the three of us. Sensing the undercurrent of authority, I now wielded quietly, yet unmistakably. For the first time that evening, the mocking smirk on Paige's face faltered entirely. Replaced by a flash of uncertainty, the tension in the room thickened, tangible and sharp. I knew the next moves, the ones I had been silently orchestrating, would define the rest of the evening. And for the first time, Lucas and Paige could no longer be certain they controlled the narrative. I let my gaze drift slowly over the guests seated around the long table, taking in their curious expressions, their whispered exchanges, the way their attention had quietly shifted from the spectacle to me. Lucas leaned forward slightly, his smirk fading as he studied my composed posture, trying and failing to read my intentions. Paige's hand twitched over her wine glass, her pale red lips pressed tight, betraying a flash of uncertainty. I reached into my purse, not hastily, but with deliberate precision, and retrieved a slim envelope. Its crisp edges gleamed under the warm chandelier light, and I let it slide across the table toward me with a subtle, authoritative motion. The waiter, previously hovering nervously, gave a slight nod as if sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. Lucas's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" he asked, voice sharp but tinged with unease. Paige leaned closer, curiosity sharpening her features, but I simply kept my calm, unbroken smile. "This," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "is a record of my involvement here." I allowed the word to settle, letting it stretch long enough for the implications to ripple through the room. I've held investments, overseen operations, and contributed to every decision that keeps this restaurant running smoothly. A subtle murmur passed through the diners. A few of the staff exchanged glances, small nods of acknowledgement barely perceptible but unmistakable. The room's energy shifted, as if an invisible weight had been removed from my shoulders and placed firmly on the table between us. Lucas's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the edge of the table. Paige's eyes widened, and the faintest tremor of fear, or perhaps recognition, crossed her face. For decades, they had assumed that my life was modest, that I had no influence, no power. Tonight, that illusion crumbled. I leaned back slightly, keeping my hands visible, relaxed. The envelope remained before me, a silent testament to years of careful planning, quiet labor, and strategic foresight. Every observer in the room, every staff member, every guest, understood the subtle shift the balance of power had tilted, and I was no longer the one on the defensive. Paige's lips parted slightly, as if she were searching for a retort but finding none adequate. Lucas swallowed hard, his previous confidence dissolving under the weight of an unseen authority he had never anticipated. And, in that stillness, that moment of revelation, I realized the first major step of the evening was complete. The hierarchy had reversed, and the game they thought they controlled was now very much mine. Chapter 6. Conditional Inheritance. I set my hand lightly on the envelope in front of me and let my gaze settle on Lucas. His shoulders were tense, jaw tight, eyes darting nervously between me and Paige. Paige's fingers tightened around her wine glass, pale and rigid. The murmurs of nearby diners faded into the background as I began to speak. Calm and deliberate. The inheritance, I said, letting the words hang, will no longer be automatic. My voice remained steady, controlled, but it carried the weight of years of unseen effort and patience. You will receive a portion only if you meet conditions I've set. Lucas's eyes widened. Conditions? What are you talking about? Paige's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of unease. I continued, letting the silence stretch between statements. Humility. You will live modestly for a year, learn the value of simple work, and engage with people you have overlooked. I looked directly at Lucas. Volunteering. You will spend time at a local senior center, caring for those who've been forgotten. The room held its collective breath. I didn't rush. I let the gravity of each requirement sink in. Lucas's fingers dug into the table, his knuckles white. Paige's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Respect. Every action you take toward others must be thoughtful and considerate. No arrogance, no dismissiveness, no entitlement, I said, letting the final condition resonate. And time. You will follow these expectations consistently for a full year before any portion of the inheritance is released. A tremor of disbelief crossed Paige's face. Lucas leaned back, trying to mask his shock with a scowl. But even he could not hide the sudden weight of responsibility now imposed upon him. I didn't soften my gaze. I didn't offer reassurance or compromise. The rules were clear. The stakes tangible. The envelope before me was more than a stack of papers. It was a statement. A declaration of accountability and moral consequence. Years of sacrifice, of careful planning, had led to this moment. Tonight, I would not simply reclaim respect, I would ensure it was earned. I lifted my head, scanning the room, letting each word settle. Lucas and Paige understood this was no empty threat, no impulsive anger. The balance had shifted completely. Tonight, the lesson would begin. The morning light filtered through the narrow windows of the modest apartment Lucas and Paige now called home. Boxes were stacked against the walls, remnants of a life once gilded, now reduced to essentials. Paige stood stiffly in the tiny kitchen, staring at the chipped countertops as if the contrast with their former mansion were a personal affront. Lucas slouched on the threadbare couch, arms folded, jaw tight, his tailored suit replaced by the simple uniform of a restaurant worker. Evelyn watched from the doorway, quiet and unassuming, letting them adjust to the shock of consequence without interference. She remembered her own years of early mornings and long nights, the way fatigue had carved itself into her bones while teaching lessons no amount of scolding ever could. This, she knew, was how change took root through experience, struggle, and reflection. Their first shift at her restaurant, a mid-tier establishment she managed personally, was a trial by fire. Lucas's hands shook as he carried trays, his movements stiff and awkward. A plate nearly slipped from his grip. Clattering against a table, a guest glanced up with surprise, but he recovered quickly, bowing his head in apology. Paige struggled at the host stand, attempting to greet customers with a practiced smile. Though impatience leaked through her forced politeness, Evelyn observed silently from a corner, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the flush of exertion on their faces, the tiny corrections in behavior that showed attentiveness. Later that week, at the nursing home, the lessons deepened. Lucas listened as an elderly man recounted stories of wartime hardships, fumbling over the details yet offering a patient ear. Paige knelt beside a woman knitting, her fingers awkwardly looping yarn at first, then gradually smoothing into rhythm as the woman guided her. They stumbled. They apologized. They laughed softly at their mistakes, and Evelyn saw glimmers of genuine humility, small but unmistakable. By the end of the first week, both were exhausted, sweat beading on foreheads, shoulders tense with effort. They returned to the apartment silent, carrying the weight of unaccustomed responsibility. Evelyn allowed herself a faint, approving smile. The lessons were beginning not complete, not easy, but undeniable. As she watched them retreat into their modest space, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Change was never instantaneous. It arrived through discomfort, through practice, and through the unglamorous work of learning respect and patience. And for the first time that week, she sensed that Lucas and Paige were beginning to understand that her rules were not punishment. They were a path toward seeing the world and themselves differently. Months passed, each one a quiet testament to the slow but undeniable change in Lucas and Paige. Evelyn watched from a distance as they navigated their new lives with increasing competence and humility. At the restaurant, Lucas moved with steadier hands, greeting customers with genuine respect and handling mistakes without defensiveness. Paige's smile had grown more natural, her patience less forced as she assisted elderly patrons at the nursing home, listening attentively to stories and offering care without expectation. Evelyn felt a quiet pride as she observed the subtle shifts, the moments when Paige hesitated before snapping at a task, but then adjusted her tone, or when Lucas apologized immediately after dropping a tray. These were small victories, often invisible to anyone but her, but they marked a tangible transformation. Years of entitlement and arrogance were being replaced, piece by piece, with responsibility, empathy, and awareness. Satisfied that the lessons had taken hold, Evelyn turned her attention to the final step, formalizing her legacy. She summoned David, her attorney, to her home, spreading the documents across the desk. The majority of her assets, she decided, would go to a charitable foundation supporting elderly women who, like her, had sacrificed silently for their families. A portion would remain for Lucas and Paige, conditional upon continued respect, humility, and engagement in meaningful work. When Lucas and Paige arrived to review the documents, Evelyn spoke calmly, her voice carrying authority and warmth. She acknowledged their growth and effort, but made clear that inheritance was no longer automatic. It was earned, contingent upon behavior that reflected the lessons they had begun to internalize. They listened, tense and attentive, absorbing the reality of their choices and the responsibility that came with privilege. As the papers were signed and the final decisions formalized, Evelyn felt a profound sense of closure. Her dignity, once challenged and disregarded, had been restored. The power dynamics of the past had shifted, and respect both earned and given now defined her relationship with her son and daughter-in-law. The room, once filled with tension and unease, now held a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement of the balance of justice, love, and accountability. Evelyn leaned back, letting a soft smile ease across her face. The journey had been long, painful, and demanding, but it had led to clarity, growth, and equilibrium. The lessons had been learned, the consequences understood, and the bonds reshaped by patience, wisdom, and deliberate guidance. She felt, at last, that the story of her family had reached a turning point, one of respect, reflection, and enduring legacy.